Good afternoon. You're all extremely welcome to this webinar, which is the last of the series that the Royal Irish Academy has been cooperating on with the Irish Research Council. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Academy and of the Irish Research Council, and we are delighted to be here today. We are going to be building on the lessons and comments from the last two webinars about the framework for research, science, for research and science in the humanities across all sectors, and that is across the higher education institutions, the funding agencies, the think tanks such as the ESRI, and also government departments. And this is building on the paper that Mary Doyle prepared for the Trinity Long Room Hub. So this is the final session, and we are going to build on things that you have said to us before and on insights that we have had. We will focus on possible actions at the end of this session. This we regard as an excellent opportunity for Ireland to build now on the creation of the Department of Further and Higher Education Research, Innovation and Skills. And the Royal Irish Academy, of which I am the president, is happy to play its part and wishes to be a nexus and a convening power for excellence in research as we go forward. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to our chair, Patricia Riley. Patricia is a graduate of the UCD School of Veterinary Medicine, and after 5 years in general practice, she joined the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. She was Ireland's first agriculture attaché to Poland. After a short period back in Dublin, working in the Department of Agriculture's National Disease Control Centre, Patricia moved to Brussels to join the cabinet of Maura Geoghegan-Quinn, where she had responsibility for research and innovation policy in areas including the bioeconomy and health and gender in research. At the beginning of the next Commission mandate, Patricia moved into the cabinet of Tibor Navracsics, the Commissioner for Education, Culture, Youth and Sport, first as his senior expert and subsequently as Deputy Head of Cabinet. After 10 years in Europe, Patricia returned to Ireland and she is currently heading the Department of Agriculture's new Animal Welfare Division. And since qualifying from UCD, she has completed an MSc in European Food Regulation, a diploma in European law, and the King's Inns diploma in law, and she's currently studying in the IPA's Doctorate in Governance program. She has an excellent overall view of research and innovation, not just in the European Union, but internationally in her former role, and played, I know for a fact, a leading part in the work that developed for the Horizon 2020 program. So it is my pleasure, Patricia, to pass over to none better to chair this last session this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. That's a very kind introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectations of this afternoon. I'm very excited to be here. I've followed the first two sessions with interest. And as Mary says, I've been working at that sort of interface between policy and science for quite some time, and higher education as well. And I think, you know, we've never really experienced a time when public policy has needed research and science more than at the moment. And my experience at a European level and indeed international level would suggest that there really isn't any silver bullet. If there were, we wouldn't be having these three sessions and this discussion. Peter Gluckman, a former Chief Scientific Advisor to the New Zealand government, talks about the development of the whole area of science advice to policy depending on the way that things have evolved in a country, you know, that not just on the size of the country, but its culture and its history and its political and social background. So I think it's a bit of a journey. From my own perspective, I've seen some countries who do this very well and some possibly who have more to learn. I think on balance, Ireland probably is already doing a lot of very good things, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. You know, we've got organizations like the ESRI that Mary mentioned, we've got Teagasc, we've got the EPA, who all give excellent advice to policy. But I suppose what we want to advance here, and based on Mary's really excellent paper, is something more systematic and more horizontal that can feed into the policy making world going forward for the country. And as Mary said, no better time than now that the new department has been established. So I think we've got three superb speakers this afternoon who are all very experienced of working at that interface. So without any more from me for now, at least, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Joseph Ryan. Joseph Ryan is the inaugural Chief Executive Officer of the Technical Higher Education Association, or THEA, which is the advocacy and representative body supporting Ireland's technological sector. He was previously Vice President, Academic and Registrar of Athlone Institute of Technology, and he's a musician by formation and was the founding chairman of the Forum for Music in Ireland. Dr. Ryan also served as the chair of the Contemporary Music Centre, Ireland's National Archive and Resource Centre for new music, supporting the work of Irish composers north and south. Joseph Ryan has taught in St. Paul's Secondary School in Green Hills, Dublin. He's also lectured in UCD and in the National University of Ireland at Maynooth. For some 2 decades, he has served as a commissioned officer in the defence. He served as a commissioned officer in the Defence Forces Music Services, where he held positions as executive officer and senior conductor and director of the Army No. 1 Band. Dr. Ryan is chair of EduCampus, which provides IT shared services to the higher education sector. And he was a founding director and ultimately served as chair of the board of the National Forum for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. So, Dr. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, all. It's a real privilege to contribute to this conversation. I acknowledge our hosts, the Royal Irish Academy and the Irish Research Council, and the foundation paper that you've mentioned, Patricia, from Mary Doyle, that is framing this discussion. Conscious that this construct is of the department and the HEI representatives with a focus on implementation and leadership, I commence with a few quick reflections. I was struck, as others were, by the opening example in Mary's paper, that call that happened between Dr. Tony Holohan and Professor Philip Nolan. The resulting level of informed support and the ability to mobilize is certainly impressive. But as Jane Grimson notes, this is based on existing capacity, research already in place, and an established network. As the pandemic proceeded, the question might be posed is whether that construct was sufficiently broad. Once one moves beyond the immediate challenge, the longer-term construct of research for public policy and society appears to require a wider range of expertise to include social behaviors, economists, psychologists, etc. It points to the reality that societal challenge generally requires an interdisciplinary response. There's a distinction to be made between focused or targeted research and the wider body of research that is created and explored in academia. In respect to the former, government has significant levers. This raises the question of timelines. The elements of the tripartite equation that the paper proposes, government, funders, and higher education, generally work to different clocks. Peter Clinch also distinguished between the political and the civil service perspectives. The construct that is sought here must be competent to fashion a medium and longer term strategy. Clearly, no one is advocating research by numbers or research hierarchy, and maintenance of academic freedom is enshrined in statute. All new knowledge is important. The real gain is in finding the connections and linkages. A number of contributors have already noted that we have many of the building blocks available. The challenge is to discover an architecture that can deliver coherence. Exemplars in the UK, Netherlands, and the USA can and have been cited, but scale is a matter of moment. The Parish of Ireland proposes that we can all know one another. In reality, this isn't the case. My own previous experience as a long-serving VP academic afforded me access to a membership of a number of national committees. But even there, the reach was limited. If one takes an individual researcher or research group, there will be disciplinary awareness and even allegiance that passes beyond any institution. But the channels for connection to the senior reaches of even their own government department are not there. The goal is to shift mode from responsive to informing. The OECD, in a strategic foresight for better policies published in October 2019, argues for a shift from the reactive to a sustained and ongoing practice of strategic foresight to, and I quote, design and facilitate strategic dialogue with the purpose of using foresight to look ahead, challenge assumptions, and draw out implications for policy and strategy, unquote. But such advice indicates a concept imbued with independence of thought. In Ireland, it's always about people. Building and sustaining networks is an obvious recommendation. Mention has been made of the IRC Oireachtas Shadowing Scheme and the SFI Public Service Fellowship Scheme. This echoes the AAAS fellowships in the US, which allow recipients to learn firsthand about the intersection of science and policy. We can cost effectively do more on this score. It has always struck me that there would be merit in exchanges between policymakers and academia. For an officer in the department or one of its agencies to spend time in an institution would foster trust, awareness, and understanding, and would affect more informed policymaking. Equally, for an academic or academic manager to have time in government or an agency would help inform an appreciation of context and offer a system perspective. A portal was mentioned. There is an advantage in having visibility on research activity nationally, but a portal requires to be dynamic, housed, and maintained. And of itself, it's only a starting point. A sectoral version of the excellent extended campus facility in MTU could be fashioned to act as a conduit between academia, community, enterprise, and policy. An additional value of such a mediated interface is that it can balance expectation and delivery. Minister Harris, in his contribution in Seminar 1, referenced two major opportunities for change. First, the new research and innovation strategy, and second, his own new department, which you've referenced earlier on, Chair, and indeed the President of the Royal Irish Academy. I agree with this, but would add the emergence of the TUs, which represent the greatest landscape change to higher education in a lifetime. The regional connectedness of the TUs is critical to realising the ambitions set out in the National Development Plan and in Project Ireland 2040. By their nature, they are embedded and connected organisations, and they embody the very spirit of what is sought from a civic university. We must also consider the researcher and what is recognised and valued. The pathways and rewards are circumscribed currently. This conversation will benefit from a widening of the scope of the outputs from research and to include policy and societal contribution. The system performance framework can play a part in this. I'm mindful also of the 2012 San Francisco DORA Declaration on Research Assessment, which broadens the evaluation of the output and quality of research. The role of research as a signifier in the advanced character of a technological university alerts us to a salient point. Much has been said about a typology of research, and not all of it helpful. The word applied is sometimes the recourse when talking of the technological sector. Not incorrect, but it's not sufficient. What marks the sector and the emerging TUs is the connection to community and place. Research is growing and it is diverse, but if one has to characterize it, it is about knowledge in use. It is about translation, and it is so often challenge-based. It is based on a long history of working with external partners. Turning to the demand side, one of the questions that arises is not just who to ask or what to ask. It's about how one frames the question. This leads to a practical suggestion. In moving to a TU world, THEA has worked with the HEA to put in place a leadership program to build capacity. I'm conscious that the IUA has embarked on the same road. And now we have a new department freed of the swamping focus on schools. There would be merit in a shared approach to leadership training. This could be tailored appropriately and would have the advantage of building friendships, trust, and a shared understanding. Structures in higher education might usefully adapt too. I'm struck by the fact that we don't have an independent think tank, such as the Higher Education Policy Institute in the UK. How does HE coalesce to inform the thinking on its ever-changing role? In the absence of such a body, how can we propose to assist a new department as it builds a strategic approach? These lacunas are arguably filled elsewhere. Consider for a moment our host for today. This series and the all-island work on higher education futures being led by Professor Jerry McKenna are commendable. But how, for instance, does the latter intersect with public policy? Moreover, if we consider who drives such debate and where it is located, and by this I mean our political class, our civil service leadership, and those who shape and guide the key agencies who support and fund research, and then ask, how are all these people trained? Is it not the case that the very diversity spoken of by Jane Grimson is somewhat wanting? It's an argument for a more democratic and inclusive construct. Considerations of broader relevance and societal impact might well be related to notions of increased diversity and broader engagement. For a small country, our primary failing is our propensity to fracture. What this proposal requires is cohesion. The potential is significant. Mary points to the disproportionate success of Ireland in Horizon 2020. Post-Brexit, this can be larger again if we collaborate and equip the relevant players to compete for Horizon Europe. In that context, the collaborative, challenge-based spirit of the call suggests that we foster far greater interdisciplinary research. A pilot has been proposed. As proof of concept, it makes sense. Addressing climate change is one obvious cross-disciplinary theme. Having a dedicated department which is largely co-locating research offers a rare opportunity. Born of a rib from the old DES, but incorporating a significant element of the old Debbie, there is a task to build both integration and launch the strategy. The new department establishes the government interface with academia and effectively could constitute its own pilot. Working with IUA and THEA, it can consider structures that can deliver the requisite linkages and awareness. The coming review of HEA legislation affords a rare opportunity to document this, and we should afford the time necessary to facilitate this consideration. With that, I offer thanks to all for listening and return to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ryan. That was a bit of a whirlwind tour of where you see not only your own sector, your own part of the higher education sector, but the future of science advice and research advice to policy. I mean, I think one thing that you said at the very beginning was an important point, which is the mismatch to some extent in terms of timing between the policy advice and input that researchers can offer to policymakers. And I think that's why these sort of the policy network approach is extraordinarily important, because unless there's a building of trust in peacetime, if you like, before there's a problem, and while the response by research will come from in response to foreseeable and things that have come out of foresight, fine, but there will also be unforeseen things. So I think that's where the trust thing comes in so strongly and so importantly. I'll move on now, if I may, to our second speaker, who's Dr. Lisa Keating. Lisa is the Director of Research and Innovation at the Irish Universities Association. She works with the group of Vice Presidents and Deans of Research of member universities to advance university research and innovation through strategic policy coordination and development. This includes working with external stakeholders in government, in funding agencies, and in the enterprise sector. Dr. Keating has overall management responsibility for the IUA Research Office, which has a significant role in relation to the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions and Euraxis initiatives within the European Framework Programme for Research and Innovation. Dr. Keating graduated with a BSc in Industrial Microbiology from UCD, where she then completed her PhD in microbial biochemistry. This was followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Universitat Hamburg in Germany and a postdoc research science position with the University of Kent at Canterbury. Subsequently, Lisa moved to the Veterinary Laboratories Agency in the UK's Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We're disproportionately represented as veterinary people here today, where she was a key player in the UK's government's flagship genomics program in TB research, exploring infection and immunity. She then moved into research and innovation policy development and implementation when she joined the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, where she was the department's liaison with the UK Research Councils and Innovate UK, in addition to leading the Life Sciences Knowledge Transfer team. Lisa then returned to Ireland and joined Enterprise Ireland to set up and manage the Commercialization Fund, and subsequently led the development and delivery of New Frontiers, Ireland's national entrepreneur development programme. Having returned to the UK to lead a university partnership programme tasked with increasing research translation capability across 5 of Yorkshire's universities, Dr. Keating came back to Ireland, we're very grateful, to join Science Foundation Ireland before being appointed Director of Research and Innovation at the IUA. So Dr. Keating, over to you.
Many thanks there. Sorry, just unmuting myself, the famous Zoom. So thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Patricia, for the very kind introduction. And thank you also to the Royal Irish Academy and to the IRC for hosting this important series of webinars and the opportunity to speak to you all today and to participate in this panel discussion. I'm quite conscious, I have to admit, that this is the third in a series of 3. And I've wondered to myself, what I might be able to add to the discussion, considering the wealth of debate that has taken place so far and Mary Doyle's fabulous paper. So I've been pondering, what can I bring to the table from my experiences? But also, I think more importantly, from the point of view of implementation, which is really what today is all about, implementation. I've been thinking, well, what can I do to make it happen? What can the sector that I represent do? How can we as higher education institutes work with stakeholders and colleagues across the system to move the dial on this space? So I think we're all agreed it is mission critical, and we're all agreed that now is the moment in time to do it. So how do we move this forward? So in preparation for today, I did, of course, look back on the last 2 panel discussions and the chat box commentary that was so alive and vibrant during the last 2 seminars, or webinars, I should say. So, and what I noticed was, what I was really looking for was the questions that keep coming up and what did it all boil down to? And what I found is that the main question was, of course, how do we encourage and support a culture change? How do we get researchers and policymakers working together to ensure that policy is informed by the best research and that research benefits the citizen and the nation through the enhancement of policy formation? And then to do that, the more specific questions came up that really highlighted the complexity of this ambition that we have. How do we know what research is being done? Where is it being done? And who is doing it? How do we foster engagement? And how do we make those connection points and promote collaboration? How do we incentivize this desired behavior that we all want to see? And how do we reward it? And how do we measure it? And ultimately, what it's about is bringing 2 distinct cohorts together. So these are researchers and policymakers, 2 groups that know they feel that they have very little knowledge of each other's words. And we want to bring them together, not only to benefit each other and the important work they do, but to ultimately benefit the public. So thinking about that, thinking about this massive culture change that we want to undertake here, notwithstanding all that's gone before, it can feel overwhelming, and it does feel like there's quite a large mountain to climb. But then I realized we have been here before, and we have scaled a similar mountain. which brings me back to my time in Enterprise Ireland. I joined EI back in 2006, 15 years ago now. And the task at hand then was to bring industry and academia together to collaborate for the benefit of each other and the benefit of the nation and its citizens. And again, it was about bringing two distinct cohorts together that knew little about each other's work. So I hope you can see the parallels and what I'm trying to reflect here in looking back at that time and the transformation that's taken place over those 15 years. At that time, I was working specifically with researchers, and they would ask me, how will I meet industry? And industry was, of course, in inverted commas, because as they pointed out, this was a nebulous concept that I talked about a lot, but they would frequently remind me that it wasn't a single entity or a limited group, that there was no door to knock on specifically, that there was no phone to pick up. It was so diffuse. And in such a large and heterogeneous group, researchers wanted to know, how could I find the person who's interested in my research? And not only are they interested in my research, but they can see the benefit of my research to what they do, to their world, to their needs. So back then, we were asking researchers to look out at this vast ocean and that we saw as opportunity. But in their view, it was just a large body of water, and it had this name tag industry hanging over it. And we were all cheering them on, saying, yes, go on, dive in there. So it's not surprising that many researchers at the time would ask, well, why would I do this? I don't know how to do this. I don't have the skills. I don't have the expertise, and I most certainly don't do the time. And if I did do this, what is in this for me? You talk of how important this is for the country, that it's such a laudable activity, and I can take all that on board, but how is it going to affect me? Is it actually going to help my career, or is it some way going to hinder my career? So there was a lot of concerns in the research community, but there was also a lot of concerns and reservations among industry members. Again, they were looking out at this vast ocean. There was thousands of researchers out there, and even more thousands research projects. And they were wondering, how will I find what I'm looking for? And even if I find the research that I need, or the researcher that can do the research that I need, they won't understand how I need to use it. They won't be able to apply it to my world. They'll want to do their own thing with it. So if I engage, will this in fact slow me down in some way? And is it really worth investing all of this time for such an uncertain outcome? Well, over a decade ago, Enterprise Ireland had about a couple of hundred companies that were availing of their supports to engage with higher education institutes. And today they have 1,600 and climbing. So we did find a way as a system to make it work. So yesterday, what I spent my day doing was asking myself, what did we do? What did we do back then? Because I think a lot of it is taken for granted now, and we don't remember the distance that we've traveled in the last decade or two. If you say industry engagement now, researchers do know what it means. I suppose what I've been trying to think about was, so how did we bring that about, and how can we reflect on that in terms of what we're trying to achieve here today? And it was really a concerted effort and a multi-pronged approach. And there was many different things that took place. So for example, there was funding made available to researchers, such as the Commercialization Fund or innovation partnerships, and a whole array of schemes and mechanisms to help researchers engage at the enterprise interface. There are also exchange programs or sector mobility programs. So for example, the SFI Industry Fellowship Program, where researchers could go and spend time in industry, and those that worked in industry, they could move into a research setting in a higher education institute or research performing organization. There was training provided and there were supports available. If we think of the Tech Transfer Strengthening Initiative, this placed tech transfer professionals throughout the higher education system, and they were there to help the researchers and to support them as they entered onto this endeavor. There was business development managers, and there was brokering events, and there was showcase events, and there was KTI. KTI was set up to act as the central point of reference for industry and academia partnership and for research commercialization. So there was a place to go. I think most importantly, there was a continued focus on demonstrating the value of engagement to industry. Those that engaged in the higher education sector grew more rapidly and weathered storms better. And once we had the success stories, once we had the data that we're always searching for, we were able to sing it from the rooftops and show the success and the benefit of that. And I suppose why I'm talking about this today is the important thing is to note that it wasn't one group or one initiative, but rather it was the system working together as a whole. And I think we need to remember how much has happened and how transformative that has been and what we can learn from that today. So what I'm thinking is, what can we take from our experiences in the past in terms of that transformative step when we consider research for public policy? And I suppose, first of all, there needs to be a number of deliberate actions to get the ball rolling. And I think that's what this is about. Over the last 2 seminars, a number of the panel members highlighted this. We need to pick a number of actions and we need to move forward with those in a concerted way, in a scheduled and determined way. And I think one of the first of these is to look at providing training and support to researchers. People cannot do something if they don't know how to do it. And we have to provide them with the skill set and the tools to be able to do that. So through Campus Engage, we can work with colleagues in the department and wider stakeholder groups across higher education sector to be able to provide training to address the specific need, and also to look at it towards our colleagues in the policy formation sector. And this will, of course, build on the work of Campus Engage today. Campus Engage has been very, very active in this space with many documents and supports provided already. And I think now is the time to build on that expertise and use it to our full advantage. Secondly, in terms of things that we could do, to move this along, I am going to steal Peter Clinch's idea. I think it was a great idea. And what he said in that first seminar was we need to identify people that have already been successful in this space. And I think this is the key. Not only does it mean that we'd have a group of individuals that can lead by example and offer us guidance and a steer, but we have those success stories that we could shout from the rooftops. I had a chat yesterday with Mooney and EI because I was trying to recall all of the different interventions used to build the industry-academia interface and then try to map it, of course, for today onto our needs in terms of research for public policy. And I asked him, what was the most important element in all that was done? And he said, building the relationships and showing their value. And I think this connects really well with Peter Clinch's comments back in the first seminar and touched on there by Joe just a few moments ago about repositories versus relationships. There is undoubtedly value in collating information on who is doing what where. We need to have this information, but it is the relationships that matter. They're what's key, and showing the benefit of those relationships. Looking back, few grew into many in the case of industry and academia interactions because someone in a company and someone in a HEI built the relationship and it worked and it was of benefit to both of them. And it then gave each of them the confidence to engage with others across the divide, as you will. And then their network grew as they became more and more competent and confident in doing this. And then others in either companies or academic institutions saw this and they were encouraged to do the same because they saw the benefits. The process was demystified for them and the supports were in place. So the important thing here, I think, is to tell the success stories, those that we have now, and to show that it can be done, but also how it can be done, because that's what builds the few into the many. I'd like to finish now because I want to allow sufficient time for further discussion and debate. And I'd just like to say that I'm really looking forward to the discussion among the panel members and also working with colleagues throughout the system over the coming months as we look to build a roadmap, because I understand that's the task at hand. And ultimately then to build the infrastructure that we need to meet the ambitions that we speak of today. So I'll hand back to Tricia and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keating. Lisa, thank you. That was excellent, really excellent intervention, and I really like that juxtaposition of your practical lived experience and interface with industry, and there are lessons to be learned, no doubt, from that. I just have a couple of observations maybe on what you said, and I must say I can't disagree with any of it. A point that you made about a lot of scientists and researchers saying that they don't have the time and the expertise and don't have the tools maybe to make that bridge to policymakers in order to offer advice. I would just say that it's important to realize that not every scientist wants to do it and not every scientist can do it. And I'm not sure that we need every scientist to be able to do it. What we do need is a critical mass of people in the different disciplines, and particularly in that interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary space that are interested in trying to interface with policymakers. And I think the one thing that came out most strongly from that excellent intervention was that it's really all about the people. It's about trust and it's about relationships. So without going too much further into my personal views on a lot of this, I'm going to introduce our third and final speaker. We've heard over the course of the last three of this and the last previous two sessions a great deal about the new Department of Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, which was established in July last. Mr. Jim Breslin was appointed Secretary General of the Department of Further and Higher Education, to give it its full title, sorry. I think, Jim, it's safe to say that there's a great deal of expectation building around the input of this department, and the convening power that the department has is already very clearly extraordinarily important. It's been tasked with implementing important programme for government commitments, including the specific commitment, and I quote from the programme for government: "We understand the vital part played by research as the basis of sound policy making across government. We will ensure that Ireland is a global leader in research and innovation across the arts, humanities, social sciences and STEM." Now, if ever I heard a positive piece of news for the people who are tuned into this afternoon's session, I think that's it. The new department has an annual budget of over €3.5 billion, inclusive of government funding for tertiary education and research and innovation. Jim, in 2011, led the establishment of the Department of Children and Youth Affairs as its first Secretary General. So he's clearly got an appetite for creating and developing new areas and new ideas, which is wonderful for this sector. Following this, he was Secretary General of the Department of Health for 6 years. He has a master's in public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and an MSc in economics from Trinity and the Institute of Public Administration. He also has a BA in economics and politics from UCD, but probably most of all, he has a great deal of lived experience at that interface between research and innovation and policy. So, Jim, over to you for your thoughts in this final session.
Thanks very much, Patricia. It's a privilege to participate in this seminar. And over the course of the series of seminars, very many factors relevant to the worlds of policy and research and their intersection have been addressed. And indeed, Lisa and Joe have just added to them. If there was ever a simplistic notion that transferring research into policy was akin to the use of a powerful hypodermic needle, it has been roundly dispelled. What we have been left with is a picture of a much more dynamic and two-way relationship. Higher levels of mutual understanding, engagement, respect and trust between those undertaking research and policy development will provide a country such as ours with a more sophisticated, more collective intelligence to address our many challenges. As the title of today's seminar suggests, to make this happen, leadership is demanded of us all. Looking back, the formative experience for me in thinking about research for policy flowed from work on the government's action plan for health research. It was done in 2009, and I can't believe it's so long ago. But the plan benefited greatly from strategic thinking that was going on in the Health Research Board at the time, led by a new CEO in Enda Connolly. The HRB had mapped its grant portfolio and identified gaps, including in respect of research for health policy and primary care research. The origin of the problem was not so much insufficient policy impact as insufficient health policy research activity. There were some very accomplished health policy researchers, but there were just not enough engaged in the considerable range of Irish health policy questions. To address this, 3 major initiatives were undertaken by the HRB. First, the introduction of the THEA programme, which supports doctoral training in health research across Irish universities. This was considered essential to expand the base of Irish health researchers. Subsequently, postdoctoral fellowships were added. Second, increase in funding and prominence for health services research and primary care research in HRB funding calls. And third, the terms of funding awards were revised to include recognition of dissemination, engagement, and knowledge exchange activities. These supply-side initiatives took time, but each has been very successful. At the same time, within the Department of Health, we were thinking about how we could promote the better use of research and data. We undertook joint consideration with the HRB as to how to make research more accessible to busy civil servants. This was the genesis of the HRB's development of its evidence synthesis service. This service summarises the global body of evidence on a particular topic or question. It is now the norm to commission such reviews when initiating significant pieces of policy development within the Department of Health. This initiative recognised the importance of knowledge brokering. In my opinion, knowledge brokering is a critical aspect to consider in creating the conditions for effective interaction between research and policy. Subsequently, within the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, I had first-hand experience of having an in-house research unit made up of multidisciplinary research team. A key benefit was the resource this team provided to their fellow civil servants. This could be in conducting a literature search, but it was just as likely to involve sitting down informally with someone and making connections between a live policy problem and a body of research, a data set, or a researcher. Open recruitment now applies at all levels of the Irish civil service, and levels of educational attainment are increasing all the time. For example, in the most recent public appointment service recruitment competitions, for the 2 most junior grades of clerical officer and executive officer, the percentage of those successful who had honours degrees or higher was 35% and 62% respectively. The presence within research units of those with advanced research qualifications and experience supports the expansion of research skills amongst staff generally. So on my return to the Department of Health in 2014, an important priority was to set up an in-house research services and policy unit within a newly established wider division of R&D and health analytics. The unit housed members of the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, a very important civil service-wide initiative to enhance this expertise within government departments. One issue commented upon in previous seminars is the different time horizons amongst researchers and policymakers. Therefore, it is important that longer-term mechanisms are put in place to address research priorities ahead of decision points being reached. Longitudinal research programmes such as Growing Up in Ireland and THEA are examples. Another is the Department of Health's funding of the ESRI research programme in healthcare reform. Close ongoing engagement between researchers and civil servants is an important benefit from these programmes. And there are many numerous other examples of such research linkages across government departments, both one-off and continuing. So now, sitting in the new department as I do, with all of the expectations you've just pointed to, Patricia, the question is, as well as addressing our own research needs, what can we do to assist in improving the relationship between research and policy more generally? The starting point in addressing this challenge should, I think, be to recognise the appetite amongst researchers to engage on major policy issues and societal challenges. This is evident from the Campus Engage initiative, which is, as Lisa set out, promoting research that aims to address issues of public interest or concern, advanced with community partners rather than for them. How can higher education strategy and institutions better support this appetite amongst researchers to contribute to policy? The European University Association's recently published document, Universities Without Walls, identifies 3 priorities for action. 1, strengthen civic engagement goes to the heart of the rationale in promoting research for policy. The second, promote interdisciplinarity, is equally important, not least to meet complex societal challenges. And the third priority, reform academic careers, has featured throughout these seminars in both the contributions of panelists and through the chat function. It includes widening the evaluation of research impact, promoting open science, adding dissemination and engagement to the core research objective of expanding human knowledge, making careers less precarious, and providing more flexibility to switch between academia and other sectors. So a few key points to summarize in concluding. My first point is to reiterate that research engagement can be greatly enhanced by the presence of research units in government departments.
Yeah.
And these units can be further developed, building on existing capabilities and the considerable success of the IGES initiative. Secondly, where departments wish to fund research programs to address policy priorities, the department and our 2 major research funders, SFI and IRC, are readily available to assist. Third, the existing civil service renewal plan has already promoted the greater use of evidence, and there is potential in the next phase of civil service renewal to develop further actions to promote research engagement across government. This could, for example, extend to the publication of areas of research interest, as has recently become the practice of the UK government. A fourth point is that knowledge brokering mechanisms can support those working on policy to access relevant research. For example, the Universities Policy Engagement Network, made up of UK universities, assists policymakers with calls for evidence, identification of experts, knowledge exchange meetings, placements and secondments, evidence synthesis and training. Such an initiative could draw upon the successful experience here in promoting engagement with enterprise through Knowledge Transfer Ireland, as Lisa has detailed, and also relevant recent initiatives such as Campus Engage, SFI's Public Service Fellowships, and the IRC's partnerships with government departments and civil society organisations. My fifth point is that there is considerable potential in supporting interdisciplinary research on major societal challenges through mission-oriented research programmes such as those under Horizon Europe. New national programmes will be considered as part of the review of the National Development Plan and the development of new National Research and Innovation Strategy as a successor to Innovation 2020. The enhancement of North-South research cooperation is also a key priority of government. Sixthly, research is an intrinsic part of higher education. Overall strategy for higher education and its evaluation must reflect the importance of supporting researchers to contribute to improvements in public policy. And my last but not least point is it is important in expanding engagement between researchers and policy to include the public, particularly communities that are seldom heard. The Minister has recently received government approval to commence planning of a large-scale research engagement exercise with the public and working in conjunction with research funders, higher education and the research community. And we look forward to planning that in conjunction with those entities and taking it forward later this year. So in conclusion, just to note all of the wealth of ideas that have come through and the interest everybody has in its implementation and the strong commitment I've seen both in the panelists and in the feedback to actually making it happen as is set out in the title of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim, for that. That's wonderful insight from the department's perspective. I'm going to keep speaking. Okay, yeah, no, I can see Jim Breslin and not myself, which is slightly, it's a much better view, but it's slightly disconcerting. I wasn't sure whether you were hearing me or not. So listen, thank you very much for that. That's been a really fantastic insight into what's already been done actually, and where we can go. And I particularly like one of your last points about including the public and the voices of those who are seldom heard. That's a point that came out in the chats in previous sessions, and I think it's a very important one. I should have said earlier along the way, we've had lots of questions coming in the chat, but please, anybody who's tuned in, questions for the panelists will be very welcome, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. I have one question, which is a question to any or all of you, really, pertinent to the current situation. So, are living in COVID-19 land. Do you think that this hopefully once in a lifetime experience will be a watershed moment for integrating research and policy? Or are we all going to run back to business as usual when and if we're all vaccinated? And like, do you see this as a real? I see this as a real opportunity, but I'm a sort of I'm an eternal optimist and hope that this is an opportunity for things to really change. I think, you know, scientists' research is very much in the limelight. Trust, I think, is quite high in scientists, even though people are cross. They're not cross with the scientists. They're just cranky about being at home with kids and dogs and everything else, and that's fine. But I'd just like to hear your views on that, and what can we do to maintain that momentum? That's the question, really.
Happy to chip in on that, Patricia. Yeah, I do think this is an accelerator, very much so. I think there's always a risk that things revert to type, but I do think the type of engagement from people who are doing research with policy is already a trend that we have seen, and the growing use of evidence in public policy making is there already. I think what COVID does is to accelerate that, and even just reflecting, and I know there's all kinds of inadequacies that can be picked in a COVID response, but reflecting on the infrastructure that the HRB had put in place, for example, on evidence reviews, but also HICWA had been funded by the HRB for research on national clinical guidelines. And I think that type of infrastructure in the context of the response to COVID, as well as the Philip Nolan references and so on, have all been critical in our response. And I think when you live through a crisis and you experience that support, you're very slow to forget about it and you acknowledge it, and it's something you want to build upon. I do feel it's part of the thinking behind the public engagement exercise the Minister is interested in, that we have an opportunity now to embed research much more centrally within our civic dialogue as a country. And I think that is the opportunity for all of us to take.
If I can, Patricia, just to complement the points that Jim was made on your question, all of us in higher education, you know, we've been bounced into a different mode of doing business, and the sort of thoughts we have now is whether those modes will actually inform future ways of learning and teaching and engaging. But I think there's a confluence of events at the moment, Patricia, not just the COVID itself, but there's all of the promise, you know, that's there with the new department. And it's that what you talked about is the convening power of a new department, I think is one of the key points. I think there's the very openness that's reflected in Jim's contribution, and indeed in the whole mode of working of the new department since last July. I just compliment the department and the leadership that Jim has given to that. I think also there's the question of Horizon Europe. You know, it's coming at this point when it gives us further opportunities. There's also the question of the technological universities. So there's a number of these coming together, which we'll never find again. And I think as we consider that, it's to take that opportunity. Thanks.
And Patricia, if I may, through the chair, come in there, just to say, I think your question in terms of, you know, what we've experienced and what the public has experienced, and their exposure now to research and how it can help, you know, solve problems and show a way. I think that's very, very important. I think going forward, well, I suppose my first thing is, I think maybe if it had only been a couple of months, maybe not, but it has been over a year, and I think it will continue to play a part. So we do have a great opportunity, I think, with the public, and to build on that. I think one of the areas that we need to work on in terms of that, though, is, and I think what the what the public does get a little bit frustrated with is the fact that there seems to be many answers to a question. I think they always thought that science gave a definitive answer. And it's trying to explain that it isn't. It's only using the best evidence that we have at the time to come up with the best solution. I mean, the situation happened in terms of masks where they weren't necessarily promoted for good reason, and then they were, and trying to explain to the public why there was such a change in that. And some of it can often be seen that researchers can't decide, or they're arguing. And really, it's healthy debate that we're having. And it's trying to bring that aspect of research to the citizen and to the public to explain that this is healthy, that there's options and that there's alternatives and different perspectives. It's not cut and dry. I think that's just an important thing that we need to definitely build on going forward, or they will get frustrated that we don't have the answer that they need.
I think that's an incredibly important point, Lisa. Thank you for making it. I mean, for me, the dialogue between science and research and society, and within society, I include policymakers and politicians. I mean, we're all part of the one society. It's not about everybody being an expert on a particular topic, but it's very important that there's a critical mass of people who understand the scientific method. So they don't expect just black and white answers, or we found the answer and there's nothing more to learn, you know, those, and of course that makes life very easy if you can have a yes or no answer. But I've mentioned Peter Gluckman before. He talks about simple and consistent communication, and he asks the scientific community to accept, and I'm quoting him here, that erudite and in many ways self-serving scholarly discourse doesn't belong on the front pages of newspapers every day. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't air those conversations, but we need to do it in a way that we're being very clear about, being very honest about not having the knowns, everything is known, and that there are unknowns, and that advice shifts according to how knowledge evolves. And that feeds into a question that came in on the chat, which I think is an interesting one, which is, are there risks associated with scientists commenting outside their area of expertise? Now, for me, to a scientifically educated and a literate public, then I don't think there is, because you can make that distinction. But in general terms, people on the Joe Duffy show or on Claire Byrne's show in the morning, what do you think? Are there risks?
Well, I'll wade in there. I think, I mean, and the minister talked about this before, there's great value in experts, and I think people do worry about experts. But there is such value in people talking about an area that they understand and they fully understand. And of course, I think one of the skill sets that researchers do have is that they're able to take information and data from other areas and build that into a thing. But there is always that concern that, you know, you don't want to assume that just because you are an expert in one area and you know how to look at the evidence and collate it in a certain way, that you could become an expert in other areas. But I mean, I think it's not a simple answer, because there are occasions where that is quite useful. And it's very, very important when we talk about interdisciplinarity that we make sure that people who are non-experts question and wonder within that group, whether it's interdisciplinary across researchers or bringing in different stakeholder groups of the citizen. It is so important that they quiz and question and wonder. So I think there is an important aspect there for people to enter areas that isn't their expertise, or else we wouldn't have the diversity of perspectives.
That's great. I don't know if any of our other panelists have any thoughts on that.
I wasn't going to say anything because it's if you like, not my area of expertise. But I suppose it's a related point that evidence is part of the decision-making process, but it doesn't give you the answer. And so there are other things like ease of implementation and so on that go into any decision. So if you are commenting on something and you see something as the best solution from a technical perspective, you should retain an element of not doubt, but an element of there could be other ways to achieve this that's slightly different to what I've recommended. But if it gets the same outcome and it can get it quicker, then all to the good. I think to be definitive in saying, because you've come up with a very good technical solution, that's exactly what should be implemented next week. There's a little bit of working through from what technically could work into what will actually work in the context we have and the resources we have at our disposal. So I haven't commented on the science, but I think the science has to be weighed up with other factors, including implementation.
I fully agree with that. I have to say, this is a sort of a coalition of the at the risk of getting into groupthink, but I just, for joking aside from experience, I fully agree with that. I mean, I've bridged that world of researchers coming to policymakers and being terribly frustrated that their research findings aren't necessarily just easily transferable as you would a piece of legislation from European international law. It's just not like that. You know, science has a hugely important role to play, but it has a role. It is not the decision making and the policy making. The only thing that feeds into decision. Human values and as you say, Jim, the simple realities of financial resources and prioritization. And it's often interesting how you frame a question as well. You know, everybody will say that animal welfare is very, very important, for example. That's the area I'm working in right now. But when you juxtapose it with the cost of food, it's a slightly different answer sometimes. So, you know, we need to take into account society's values and relative priorities. Some questions and comments really coming in on the chat on early stage career researchers and the value of, I think what has come up as a thread in all three of the sessions so far has been that value of exchange in and out of industry, in and out of government departments and agencies, between academia and higher education and these areas. Is there anything specific, either in the technical university side or that you can think of from the department's perspective, that you can see increasing the impact and increasing the volume of that sort of exchange, or generating interest in that sort of exchange from government departments and from the higher education institutions themselves? I can give that to any of the three.
I don't know if I'll exactly answer your question, but I'll jump in there, Patricia, if I may. Just to say, I think, first of all, in terms of early career research, it's so important to have an array of skill sets and to be able to have an opportunity to follow different career paths. And I think that's really important. So having the chance, and this goes back to your comment after I had finished my original spiel, your comment about, you know, going in, you know, working with policymakers isn't for everyone. And we would have found that as well in terms of asking researchers to work with industry or to work with it. So we don't need a researcher to be able to do all of those things. We need a lot of researchers who do a lot of different things, and they have a chance to experience those different things. So I think greater exposure to be able to work in the policy side, to be able to see it, whether it's short visits or longer term secondments, I think that's so important in terms of career development. And doesn't necessarily mean somebody would have a degree, a career in academia or as a senior government official, but just understanding that helps you to move forward with your career and decide what's best for you and what are the skill sets available to you. So I think that's very important, and looking at ways that we can increase that would be very, very helpful. I think at one of the last webinars, and it may have been Peter Clint, so I can't keep quoting Peter or else he'll start trademarking his ideas from me, but I think he was talking about like that in terms of PhD students. How do you incorporate that element in it? I think the biggest barrier we face is people don't like being outside their comfort zone. So we need to give them exposure to different areas so that they don't see them as leaving their comfort zone, but entering into something that's another opportunity or another possibility that they can go to.
And if I may, Patricia, just to come in on that,
Please,
Thanks very much. I think Lisa captures it very well. It's not a single path, it's a range of experience. That itself is a value for the researcher. It builds connections. And I think if we move through this, because I've noticed a number of comments, Patricia, around funding, if we look at a construct that might follow from this, it seems to me that building the sort of linkages that we're talking about here and maybe putting in place a construct from this will actually heighten for the department, for the whole of the higher education establishment, including the funders. It'll heighten the awareness of the value of research, which again is, I think, for all of us, a very good contribution to the public debate. Thanks.
Patricia, yeah, I would just agree with Lisa and Joe, and particularly on the type of skills that can help people on that journey. But I would say, I think it's about fluidity. It's not just about a one-time move. I think, and I agree with your opening comments that we shouldn't hit ourselves over the head and say we're off, because we're not. But I do think on that fluidity issue that there are other jurisdictions which are considerably more fluid as between academia and the public service. I have the memory of being in Cambridge and Harvard in, I think it was 2004, whenever the election for John Kerry and George Bush took place. And everybody, of course, because Cambridge was very democratic, when the election results came in, everybody was especially disappointed. But the most disappointed people were the people on faculty who thought they were going to DC and wouldn't be teaching next semester. And that's the way it works. I'm not saying their system works well, because basically assistant secretary and above all changes with the change in regime. But that idea that you're sitting in a class being lectured by somebody who is both an academic and a practitioner one day, and they're in the White House in a number of months' time again. I think there's some of that. You don't want all of your people on either side of that in academia or public service to be moving all the time. But some of that interchange, I think, is to be encouraged in a way that people find hard at the moment to negotiate that.
I think that's really valuable. And actually, Jim, you lead me to a point that I was hoping to be able to make, which is you talk about other jurisdictions. I know in our preparatory meeting, and Mary, I know the decision, Mary Doyle, I know the decision was made when this series of seminars was being put together to confine it to the Irish experience. And I think that has been very valuable. This has been a very safe space for Irish people to check into and to open up this discussion. But I think there is a lot to be learned from other jurisdictions. As I said at the beginning, I don't believe that there is a silver bullet, that there's a one-size-fits-all system either. But I do think that we do have things to learn from others. And I mean, like Jim's experience, when I was quite taken aback when I went to Poland in 2004. One of the first people I met was a deputy minister in the department of the Ministry of Agriculture called Jerzy Plewa, who about 6 months later, when the government changed, was back in academia as a lecturer in agricultural economics. He subsequently went on to be the head of DG Agri in Brussels. So that sort of flexibility is incredibly valuable to the country itself, but also to the individual in terms of their own career progression. And that's a question, and it's something that I'd like personally to see this conversation move on to another phase of looking at the experience elsewhere and what can be learned from European and indeed worldwide partners. I'm conscious of time. We're at 8 minutes past. If you'll indulge me, we'll go on until 1:15. If there are more questions, please come in with them. But I'm conscious also that Mary's paper towards the end talks about implementation deficit disorder, a phrase that I really rather like, because we're great at sitting around talking about things, but actually what's going to happen next. Now, my suggestion has been, let's take a look at the international experience. Let's also not sit back in any sort of complacent way, but let's congratulate ourselves for what we do well and build on that, and let's take advantage of the new department's existence. But I'd like to hear from the panelists about what you think should happen next.
We have the difficulty there of not being able to raise hands, I think. So we're all very polite.
No, and I should be bossier and just nominate people. Sorry.
So I will, since I've already suggested, so within what we can do, as I said, at Campus Engage, led by Kate Morris and within the IUA, but working across the whole system. I think that's very important in terms of bringing that out much broader across higher education, and a particular focus, I think, on the policymakers and how we can focus on that engagement there. I mean, I see researcher, when we talk about engaged research, I see it in terms of engaging with all end users. So whether that's industry or policymakers or the citizen, it's so important that we engage with all. But in terms of trying to do something to get it started, in particular in this area of public policy, I think we do need a specific action there to start bringing people together and to start working on the training there. And the other item I think that we can specifically take forward is looking at those success stories and those champions and start identifying there. And that's the first place that I would begin. So that's what I'm doing next week. So I don't know. I don't know what comes after that. But obviously there's been so much contribution through the chat box in 3 seminars that I think there's a wealth of information and suggestions there on where we can go, and drawing up a roadmap over the next few weeks, I think, will be key.
If
Thanks
I can jump in rudely,
please.
Patricia, because rudely does it here, I gather. It's thanks. The mention earlier on of the new research and innovation strategy, I think that's going to be key. Obviously, that's linked in, or will link into the HEA legislation. And I'm just, what should we do? I think we should ensure there's enough time to have this conversation. Lisa has talked about a few weeks, and I don't think this has to be a long conversation, but I do think it has to be a deep conversation. Secondly, as I look back over the 3 seminars, Patricia, there's been so many very good concrete suggestions here. There's obviously a question of collating those, but a number of commentators in the chat have talked about things that we've essayed previously, and they hadn't either stuck, the stickiness wasn't there, or they haven't been developed. So there is a question, you go back to the implementation deficit disorder piece, there's a question of actually launching onto these and thinking them in the longer term and sticking with them. I like your idea of doing a benchmark piece, Patricia, against foreign experience. I think there's so many good examples. Some of them have been referenced here, but we haven't actually developed them. And then I think that idea of a pilot does actually have merit. I think prove the concept. Thanks.
Brilliant. Jim, any final words?
Well, I think we can use the research and innovation strategy to profile this and codify it. But I think there's a space that will be done later this year. There's a space between now and then for like a coalition of the interested to come together, and not just interested, but prepared to actually commit resources and intellectual capital to doing something. I would pick a small number of issues. I would pick 3 rather than 30. 3 maybe for each, 3 for the civil service, 3 for research, and work them through. I would locate any technical initiative, so an IT system or whatever that might be. I would locate it within a clear approach to the kind of human issues underlying this, because I think you could spend 2 years working on something technical, but if you don't actually get the human factor understood and what influences people and what motivates them, I don't think it'll take off. And that can be, and going back to Lisa's point, that can be guided by people who've walked this road before and who can tell you how that actually feels to live that. So I would include some of those people in that coalition of the interested, and certainly the department would be very interested in working with others to try and bring this to a point where it's clear policy. But I think ahead of the actual policy decisions, we can do some thinking and maybe even some experimentation.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And I think, in terms of the Coalition of the Willing, there was a comment earlier in the chat box from Anna Kelly that that received a lot of support, and I have to say she has mine as well, which is the importance of including higher education practitioners who actually enact and mediate policy in the higher education space. So I think that's an important point I didn't want to leave out. I'm very heartened by the fact that there hasn't actually been a lot of pitching here for funding for research and innovation, and not because not because that's not important. It is important, but I was a little bit afraid because it did come up in the previous discussions, in the chat boxes in the previous discussions quite a lot, and I think it is important to resource the whole provision and enablement of science advice to policy. But I think we do need to disaggregate the discussion about the funding for the higher education and research sector from science advice to policy, because otherwise there's a risk of damaging that independence and compromising the value of the relationship. And I suppose that's my final word on this is the word relationship. I think what you said there, Jim, about the technical platforms or whatever comes out of this being important, I agree with you. It's really important that is done in whatever way the sector agrees is best, but it's secondary to people. We're good at relationships in Ireland. We should be very good at this business. I think we are pretty good at it, and I think we have a lot more that we can do to make us even better. So if anybody has any final comments to make or thoughts to share, please do. Otherwise, I will be, I'm very honoured to have been asked to chair this session. I'd like to thank the Academy. I'd like to thank Jane in particular from the Research Council, and Mary Canning for chairing. And with that, I will stop talking, and I look forward to seeing the output of these three wonderful sessions. Thank you all very much, all three speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks all.